Welcome to this explainer. You know, when we walk the sun-drenched cobblestones of Rome today, grabbing a folded slice of pizza or maybe a golden fried risotto ball, it kind of just feels like a trendy luxury, right? Just a fun, casual bite to keep us fueled up for a day of sightseeing. But to truly understand this ancient city, we have to look much deeper. I want you to imagine literally peeling back those cobblestones, layer by layer, century by century. Because what we're about to do today is dig into the raw, gritty history of everyday, ordinary people. We're going to completely bypass the emperors, skip the grand marble monuments, and ignore all those sprawling wars. Instead, we're reconstructing an entire human world, just through the lens of daily survival.
So the crucial question we really need to ask ourselves is this. When you eat on the streets of Rome, whose history are you actually tasting? Well, I'll tell you right now, you aren't tasting the legacy of patricians or wealthy conquerors, no way. You're actually participating in a multi-millennial ritual of the urban poor. Eating prepared meals out on the dust, the noise, and the crushing crowds of the public street, that is not some modern commercial invention. It's an incredibly resilient survival mechanism. For thousands of years, the super-dense architecture and the severe economic marginalization of Rome's working classes meant that eating in the street was an absolute necessity. It was completely dictated by the unforgiving constraints of poverty.
Antiquity, the architecture of necessity. Let's step right past those grand patrician villas and head straight into the suffocating, highly fire-prone apartment blocks of the ancient Roman Empire, which were known as insulae.
Over 2,000 years ago, the vast majority of plebeians, laborers, and slaves lived in these cramped quarters that had absolutely zero home kitchens. I mean, think about it. Lighting a fire in a crowded, timber-framed insula was basically a death wish. So they relied entirely on what were called thermopolia. These were ancient Roman cookshops. They featured these straight or sometimes L-shaped masonry counters, often beautifully frescoed by the way, with large earthenware storage jars, called dolia, embedded directly into the stone itself. These heavy jars held hot, ready-to-eat stews, legumes, and watered wine, and they served it all directly to the bustling street outside.
This setup brilliantly illustrates just how staggering the divide in ancient Roman society really was. On one hand, you've got the wealthy elite. They're dining in private banquets inside grand, airy villas, eating meals meticulously prepared by highly sought-after, live-in slave chefs. But on the other side, the plebeian dining experience was this profoundly public, intensely sensory ordeal. Picture this: the deafening noise, the acrid smoke pouring from the hearths, and the crushing heat of the street, as ordinary citizens handed over a few coins for just a scoop of hearty duck, snail, or fish stew from a steaming dolium. This wasn't just a lifestyle choice, this was everyday survival. And it was perfectly frozen in time, preserved by the volcanic ash of Mount Vesuvius back in 79 AD.
I like to think of this history as a kind of chronological excavation. We've just unearthed the ash-covered counters of ancient Pompeii and Rome from 79 AD. But now we're going to jump forward, leaping right past the fall of the empire to uncover our next layer of survival. We'll be heading into the 16th century, specifically to the year 1555, before eventually arriving at the industrial meatpacking era of 1888.
The ghetto. Culinary resistance. We're going to immerse ourselves now in the extremely cramped, walled environment of the Roman Jewish ghetto, which was established by papal decree. So in 1555, the city's Jewish population was forced into this highly restricted, impoverished enclave, right along the marshy banks of the Tiber River. They were subjected to incredibly severe civil and economic restrictions. But out of this profound isolation and institutional poverty birthed something truly remarkable: Cucina Ebraica Romanesca. This wasn't just cooking, folks. This was an edible history of survival. It was almost like a cryptographic gastronomy. Because they had such restricted access to prime produce, they had to utilize cheap, discarded ingredients. Take the famous carciofi alla Judia, for example, deep-fried Roman artichokes. They took these tough woody thistles that everyone else was literally throwing away, and through absolute culinary genius, transformed them into these golden, crispy masterpieces of defiance. Masterpieces that actually outlasted the very popes who tried to suppress them.
And then consider the sensory experience of pizza ebraica. Now, despite the name, this is absolutely not your typical cheese and tomato pizza. Actually, scratch that. It's not a pizza at all. Contemporary accounts describe it as this incredibly dense, intentionally charred block of a cookie. It was brought over by Sephardic Jews fleeing the 1492 Spanish Inquisition. The exterior is charred specifically to balance the intense sweetness of candied citron, raisins, and pine nuts hidden inside. But here's the crucial part. It was historically made without any dairy or eggs. And that was no mere dietary preference. It was a clever way to hide contraband ingredients from the authorities while strictly maintaining kosher laws in a really hostile environment. Every dense, marzipan-like bite is literally a historical footnote of human endurance.
Testaccio, the economics of meat. Now, we leave the historic center behind and step right into the gritty, industrial neighborhood of late 19th century Testaccio.
From 1888 all the way to 1975, Testaccio was completely dominated by the matataio, which was Europe's largest slaughterhouse. I want you to imagine the deafening sounds of livestock, the sharp metallic clang of butcher hooks, and that heavy iron-rich scent of blood just hanging thick in the air. This single, massive facility totally dictated the culinary and socioeconomic reality of the entire surrounding area. And it's right here that we meet the concept of the quinto quarto, or the fifth quarter. We're talking about the offal, the tripe, the oxtail, and the internal organs that were left over after a butchered animal was divided up. This represented the absolute lowest rung of the economic ladder.
See, a very rigid social hierarchy dictated exactly how this meat was distributed. Step 1. The prime cuts were carted away to the wealthy elite. Step 2. The roasts were reserved for the clergy. Step 3. The standard cuts fed the military and the commercial class. And that left Step 4, the fifth quarter. The literal bloody scraps were left for the slaughterhouse workers, who are known as scortachini. These laborers lived in crowded tenement blocks right across the street. And get this, they were actually partially paid in these cheap, tough, discarded organs. Their wages were literally paid in offal.
So what exactly do you do when your paycheck is a pile of tough animal organs? Well, you adapt with astounding ingenuity. The local taverns surrounding the slaughterhouse masterfully transformed these super modest, discarded ingredients into the foundational masterpieces of modern Roman cuisine. Things like coda alla vaccinara, which turned incredibly tough oxtail into this meltingly tender stew with celery and a surprising touch of cocoa. Tripe was stewed down into hearty perfection. And then there's piquiapole, which brilliantly repurposed dry, leftover boiled beef. They'd simmer it a second time in a thick, sweet, and spicy sauce of onions and tomatoes just to infuse it with moisture and fat. Once again, sheer necessity birthed absolute culinary innovation.
The edible history of Rome. So how do all these deep historical layers, antiquity, the ghetto, and the slaughterhouse, actually connect to the modern street foods you might encounter today?
It really all comes down to the structural necessity of utilizing leftovers and basically surviving through food. Take the incredibly famous supli al telefono, for instance. This crispy, golden fried rice ball filled with ragu was born from that exact same instinct, the absolute need to creatively use leftover ingredients. When you break it in half, the hot mozzarella stretches out just like an old-school telephone cord, which is exactly where it gets its name. And today you can even find modern pizza pockets called trapezzini, stuffed with that very same piquiapole beef stew that was born in the shadows of the slaughterhouse. These portable street foods are basically time capsules, carrying labor-intensive, working-class culinary traditions straight into the 21st century.
So I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought. The next time you're enjoying a quick Roman meal on the go, whose history are you really tasting? You aren't just having a quick snack. You are consuming an artifact of human endurance. You are tasting the fire-prone ancient insula, the walled confines of the 16th century ghetto, and the grueling labor of the 19th century slaughterhouses. You're experiencing the edible history of a living, breathing civilization that learned exactly how to survive and ultimately thrive, one bite at a time. Definitely keep that in mind the next time you're walking those cobblestones.